Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. My name is Chris Kwai. I'm the Director of Strategic Learning here at Biz Group. And thank you very much for giving up your time to join us today to discuss the concept of change fatigue. And specifically the question around, is your workforce engaged but exhausted? I'm delighted that we're joined today by Carl Francis, a very good colleague of ours from our assessment partners Podium. Carl, good afternoon.
Hi, Chris. Good to be here. Great to be back in Dubai.
Excellent. There's a number of things we want to be covering today, and we want to make this as interactive for you as possible. And I appreciate there may well be a number of different questions. We will allow you to share your thoughts and your questions in the chat and the Q&A section throughout this call, but we'd probably try to encourage you to share those more towards the end of the session so we don't interrupt the flow too much. I'll also point out that we'll be sharing the results of this particular white paper with you after this session has closed so that you can digest that at your own leisure. But the intent today is to be able to cover some of those key points and really try to understand this concept of change fatigue. Before we do so, I know we have a number of people on the call, some of whom are familiar with Carl and have worked with you before in the past, but perhaps for those that aren't so familiar, if you could just take a second to introduce yourself.
Indeed. Good afternoon. My name's Carl Francis. I'm a chartered psychologist in the area of industrial organizational work psychology, and I am operations director at Podium, who are a work psychology consultancy, assessment developer, and test publisher.
So good stuff. The credentials are there.
Thank you.
So, why did we start looking at this? We have had a number of conversations recently and over sort of previous months around this concept of people perhaps feeling a little bit strained or tired. And we've had several conversations and indeed conversations with you as our clients around this particular phenomenon. And we've termed this particular sort of occurrence as change fatigue. But for the benefit of those on the call who are perhaps not quite so familiar, what actually is change fatigue? What does it mean?
Okay. Perhaps the simplest summary definition of change fatigue is a personal perception that might be expressed as there is too much change going on around here. Okay. That can be the result of the size of change. So one big change could lead to this idea of change fatigue. It could be the quantity of change. So rather than one big change, there are many changes happening simultaneously. Or it could be the pace of change. All of these things lead to this perception and experience that I'm struggling to deal with this in terms of the resources that I have available to me. There's too much change going on around here. I am fatigued by that quantity, size, or pace of change.
And that was one of the things that actually led to this in the first place, wasn't it?
Exactly.
The conversations that you and I were having, the conversations we're having with you as our clients, and just sort of this feeling in general that people are there, they're switched on, they're turning up, they're showing up for work, and yet increasingly there is this sort of pressure and expectation.
Exactly.
So we decided to put together this white paper, and Carl will run through the details of that in more detail. Essentially, this was our opportunity to really try and explore this concept of people being present and yet potentially not being present. Perhaps this exhaustion starting to come through. So
exactly.
The idea was we came up with this sort of synopsis, this scenario, and we then interviewed a broad range of individuals from across the region. Some of you may well have been part of that particular survey. In an anonymous attempt to create this data pool where we could start to investigate some key parameters, which I know you're going to go into in more detail.
Exactly. So through our conversations, we identified this topic as an area for interest. And once we'd identified this notion that change fatigue might well be an issue that's sitting behind the conversations that we were having with clients, the first step and part of the discipline of work psychology is to go back to the evidence, to have a look at the literature and the research that has been done into this area of change fatigue.
So when you talk about literature, just to sort of preempt where you're going to go to next, what do we actually mean? Is it just theoretical stuff? Is this concept or is this hard fact?
This is what we mean by literature is that when you are interested in understanding an area of organizational, team, or individual performance, what body of knowledge exists out there in the scientific community already. Because work psychology is all about the scientific understanding of how organizations, team, and people perform. So essentially, you go to the academic library and you search the literature that says, has this been explored before? Do we have a clear understanding of what it means? Do we understand how it impacts on people? And there will be a body of literature. So many people have published papers. These will be academics from significant institutions, peer-reviewed papers that say we have explored change fatigue, we have explored the ideas behind it, how it manifests itself, how it affects people. So we went to the literature to understand what change fatigue is, what might cause this thing called change fatigue, and what the effects of that might be on real people in real jobs, in real workplaces.
And I think it's important to stress that, actually, isn't it? Is that when eventually people get a chance to read this white paper as a result of this call, they actually do get a chance to reflect upon that. This isn't just pulled from the air.
Exactly.
This is based upon scientific research. Yeah. This is based upon study of various different factors over a number of years and different areas.
Exactly. So we had a look at that literature. We did what's commonly known as a literature review. And from that, you can synthesize all of the ideas that are coming out of that literature review that inform that question. What is it? What is change fatigue? What causes it? And we operationalized that literature review into a change fatigue model. And from that model, we constructed a survey that allowed individuals who complete that survey to say whether they were experiencing this thing called change fatigue, and specifically whether the issues that contribute to change fatigue were very real within that survey population.
And this was a very simple survey, wasn't it?
Yeah. So when we operationalized that model of change fatigue, we identified that there are 4 potential elements of change fatigue that can contribute to this overall experience of change fatigue in the workplace. Part of that was the pace of change. So the pace of change can lead to this fatigue within people and the way that they experience the workplace.
When you say pace, that's...
Quite simply, the rapidity with which change is happening. Things are changing very rapidly, and I'm running to keep up. That's the kind of idea about the pace of change.
I mean, sort of today's, I suppose, not just work environment, but personal environment and everything else as well.
And that I think is a really valuable observation. Whilst clearly we are interested in if the workplace is contributing to this sense of change fatigue, we do live in a particular time when so many things are changing in the wider world and our wider lives, and it can be difficult to separate those out. But clearly, looking at change within the workplace is important for us here too. So when we operationalized this model, we identified that the pace of change can lead to this perception of change fatigue, and something that we called change skepticism can lead to change fatigue. And that's probably explained along the lines of what is my historical experience of change? And whenever change has been implemented in this organization before, has it been done well? Right. Is it well managed? And has it stuck? Or is it the opposite end of that scale? We're always trying to change things. These change initiatives peter out eventually and nothing much happens. So that's the kind of idea behind change skepticism. If things are changing, it can lead to uncertainty. Right. And that can be uncertainty about me, my future, my long-term career, or it could be uncertainty about, will the organization be the same in the future? Will the organization survive these change pressures? So uncertainty about me, my future, the future of the organization. And all of those things, ultimately, somewhere in the idea of fatigue is this idea of, of personal tiredness, and we've called that psychological exhaustion. So when we developed our change fatigue survey, we developed a series of questions that spoke to each of those things: pace of change, skepticism about change, uncertainty about my personal future, and am I feeling exhausted? So that was what the survey was, questions that tapped into those ideas.
And it is pretty important to state at this point as well that normally a survey of this type, you would run around a particular organization. You take the pulse of that organization. But for this example, we wanted to take a broader approach. We wanted to be able to look at a spectrum of different industries, employers, all of those kind of, to get almost a state of the nation kind of.
Exactly. And that made this particular exercise really quite interesting. And yes, you're quite right. This kind of survey would perhaps very frequently be done within an individual organization. So, how is change fatigue in this company right now? But our question, leading from the dialogue that we were having, the conversations we were having, is this more generalized? Yeah. Is this a widespread phenomena within the Dubai business community right now? Through the engagement from you guys at Biz with your client group, we looked at both public sector, private sector, a broad cross-section of organizations across Dubai, just to get the feel for how widespread is this notion of change fatigue right now? Is it real? Is it happening?
And I know we'll share those results shortly and also in the report as well. But that wasn't the only thing you looked at, was it, within the survey?
One of the things that came very clearly out of this literature review that we talked about was that if change fatigue is happening, if it is present and if it is real, then there are consequences.
Right.
And those consequences are on the engagement of the individual who is experiencing fatigue.
Okay, so by that, the person who's going through this particular change scenario, for example, their motivation or their...
Exactly. Now, we call this second element of the survey a state engagement survey.
Okay.
Now, we called it state because it is something that can change within the person. So throughout their career history, they've been in their job for a while. I am perfectly satisfied and engaged and happy with my working life. But if over time they continue to experience fatigue, you can only keep running so fast for so long. And if I've been running too fast for too long, I'm going to get fatigued. And what happens when you get fatigued? I want to stop. To translate that idea of I want to stop into what that might mean for motivation around the workplace, I was engaged previously, but now I'm not. So state engagement is what we measured as the second part of the survey.
So of course, that then has ramifications in terms of employee retention, whether stuff is actually getting done, whether we're actually going to exceed or achieve targets, all of that kind of.
And that was the whole point of that element of the survey. Do people remain engaged if they are experiencing fatigue? And a little bit like change fatigue, we had to operationalize that engagement in terms of what that might mean for how the individual is feeling about their working life. And again, we had 4 elements of that state engagement survey. We asked questions that help people to express whether they are still satisfied, so whether they still have job satisfaction. Am I rewarded by going to work? Am I rewarded by what I'm being asked to do? Do I still feel involved in what is happening in and around the workplace? If change is happening, am I involved in that change, or is it being done to me rather than with me? Do I remain committed to the organization? Do I remain committed to my role? So we had a commitment measure and also an empowerment measure, because sometimes if change happens, people can feel like their destiny has been taken away from them. Change is being done to me. I'm no longer able to influence the outcome of what I do or the outcome of the mission of the organization. I'm no longer empowered to do the work that I originally used to do. So those were the things that were involved in that engagement survey. So overall, we constructed a survey that measured those 2 big ideas, change fatigue, as we defined it, and state engagement. So if there was fatigue, did we see any impact on engagement?
And do you find that the anonymous nature of these kind of surveys actually reflects in the results?
I think that that's absolutely essential, because if people if an organization wanted to have an honest view of how people are feeling, if there was the possibility that the management looks at the results of a survey and says, oh, he or she said that, that's not going to play well. And therefore, I think it's really important that the results from this kind of thing are indeed anonymous. And just to speak to that point a little bit further, as well as asking these fixed structured questions about these elements of change fatigue and these elements of state engagement, we built into the survey some free field text to be able to gather some qualitative data, as well as quantifying these aspects of fatigue and engagement. So at the end of each section, people were able to give a response. How do you feel about the pace of change? How do you feel about your satisfaction? How do you feel about your commitment? And people were able to put free text comments.
Was there anything interesting coming back in the free text?
Absolutely. And it really helps you to understand and interpret the numbers that you're seeing in the survey itself. And we might get the opportunity to talk about some of that when we have a look at the specific results.
Okay, great stuff. Well, in that case, I know you have some slides prepared. You've got some summary of these key findings. If we could perhaps just share those on the main screen, that'd be really useful. Then Carl, perhaps you can talk us through some of your thoughts around these.
Yeah, exactly. So these were, if you like, the change attitude scales, the change fatigue part of the survey. And starting top left, we described that part of change fatigue could come from change skepticism. Do I believe that change is well managed? Do I believe that it tends to be successful? Perhaps the easiest observation to make in that change skepticism graph is that nobody expressed low change skepticism.
So what does that mean for the layperson? What does that mean?
So change skepticism, is change well managed? Is change successful? If we do change, does it actually help? And nobody had low skepticism. We've got a little bit of high skepticism. Change around here might not be well managed. It's not seen through to the end. It doesn't tend to stick. It doesn't tend to be successful. And you can see that from the distribution of those bars on the graph, the vast majority of people expressed a degree of skepticism.
Which speaks volumes.
It does. We do have some concerns about whether change is being well managed, about whether change tends to stick, whether change is properly planned and implemented. So there were some concerns expressed.
And this can come down to a number of different factors, can't it? As you say, from whether things are planned properly, communication piece, how individuals have felt about going through change previously, of course, will have an impact upon their acceptance of what they may be going through now.
One of the important things about change is that people find it much more difficult to adapt to if it isn't clearly defined. People can manage to deal with change if there is a clear purpose, a clear need, a start point, a plan to implement it, an identified end point.
So communication and management of that
is really important. And if you don't have that, perhaps the next area of the graph that we're seeing on screen is easier to understand, because again, in terms of uncertainty. So as a result of change, am I experiencing any feelings or thoughts of uncertainty about my future, the progression of my career, the outcomes for the organization? And whilst there was nobody reporting really high levels of uncertainty, you can see that nobody is also reporting really low levels of uncertainty. And again, there is a degree of uncertainty in the entire population across all of those sectors that we survey.
And again, if you then think about everything else that's going on in terms of not just someone's working life, but their personal life. We're talking about things at the moment in terms of cost of living. People are talking about rents going up, interest rates rising, school fees rising. There's so many different things in terms of this uncertainty piece. But it plays not just into your working life, is it? It's greater than that.
It is. And I think that there certainly could be an element in terms of if people are feeling a degree of uncertainty, that it might be what's going on in the wider world. Although we did try to focus the questions within this survey to try and capture whether this was a result of change fatigue within the organizational or the working part of their lives.
And that's just down to the wording.
It is. So questions like, I'm unsure how change will impact my department. We're unsure about how this will affect me in my working life. Change is happening in the organization in an unpredictable way. So the questions were focused about organizational change, but you're quite right. I think that this could indeed also be part of a wider perception of uncertainty. And it's well known, I think, that the psychological impact of uncertainty can lead to anxiety, and maybe to a certain extent, anxiety is a function of that uncertainty, and ultimately anxiety in the workplace leads to workplace stress.
Well, again, another topic that is increasingly discussed and talked about, particularly in this region now, is this sort of almost the mental well-being of an employee and the employees in general, and it's all contributing towards.
And in fact, when we did that literature review, some of the publications we found that speak to change fatigue came from within the workplace stress literature.
Right.
So again, change fatigue can very much be related to this issue and concern for workplace stress.
Okay.
And again, perhaps the two most telling parts of the survey are in the two right-hand graphs there: psychological exhaustion and change pace. If we take change pace first of all, if we ask people about the pace of change that they are experiencing in their organization and whether they are concerned about that pace of change, there were no low or low moderate scores. Everybody has got moderate through high concern about the pace of change.
So again, for me, layman's terms, there are concerns about how quickly things happen.
Exactly.
So combine that with perhaps a lack of planning, a degree of skepticism, a concern about how fast things change.
Yeah. Put all of those things together, and what do you get? If you ask people to run fast for a long time, they get tired.
Okay.
And that perhaps is reflected in that psychological exhaustion. And again, there are no low scores. Nobody is saying, no, not me, I don't have psychological exhaustion. Everybody is saying, even though we've got just a few low moderate scores, people are saying, yes, I am suffering from a degree of exhaustion. That psychological exhaustion is certainly there. So to summarize all of those elements that we're seeing there, overall, the conclusion, when we looked at a cross-section of organizations across the business community in Dubai, people are saying, yes, I am experiencing, feeling, perceiving change fatigue as a result of what is going on in my work life.
And again, it's pretty important to reiterate, this is a broad spectrum.
Yeah.
This is not one client group. This is not one organization or one particular type of employee. This is across a range of our clients.
Exactly.
In a number of different areas.
And I think that's what makes this exercise, this little project that we did, really interesting, that it is a snapshot, a cross-sectional snapshot of the business community of Dubai right now. And across that broad business community, there is indeed some indication from this survey that change fatigue is real in people's working lives.
Okay. And what about the second part? I mean, we've titled this Engaged but Exhausted.
Exactly.
Let's go and look at the next sort of set of findings that you have. I know you have another super slides for us there.
Yep. Okay. So this is the results of that state engagement survey.
Okay.
And you can see from the titles of the 4 graphs on screen, the things that I mentioned earlier: satisfaction, involvement, commitment, and empowerment. And it's pretty easy to see that all of those bars sit towards the high end of the scale. So the biggest distribution we've got was in satisfaction. So there are a few people that are starting to say, I am not as satisfied, energized, rewarded by my workplace experience as I used to be. But on the whole, the majority of people in that survey remain expressing good degrees of job satisfaction. I still feel rewarded by what I do. I still look forward to going to work and doing my job. So we still have that satisfaction.
Which is interesting, isn't it? I'm tired. I'm concerned about the pace of change and what's going on around me, and yet I'm still overall satisfied. I still enjoy doing what I do.
And hence the title of the paper, engaged but exhausted. You could put it the other way around. Yes, I'm exhausted, but I am still engaged. So I've still got job satisfaction. I still feel involved within what my organization does. I still feel part of the organization. I still feel able to contribute. I'm still empowered by my organization. I can still make a difference. I can contribute to the outcome of my team, my department, my organization. And people remain committed. We've got really high levels of job commitment. so people still remain committed to what it is that they're doing at work.
And when you say committed, how did we actually ascertain that was the case?
Yeah, the part of that could have been, well, look, we have to be committed because in an uncertain world in my private life, with all of the change that's going on, it might be, well, I've got to be committed to the job because I've got to keep paying the rent, I've got to keep paying the mortgage or what it might be. And that was where that qualitative data really became quite important. I think we could probably take some wider interpretation from the other three scales. Okay. They are committed because they're empowered, involved, and satisfied. But we saw that by reflecting on some of those qualitative comments when we said to people, okay, what else had you got to say about your commitment? And I've got a few notes here.
So they're not showing they're committed because of some sort of fear element, that if they're saying the wrong thing or they seem to be doing the wrong thing, that there's that uncertainty?
That's not what we're getting back from the survey. And that, again, is the benefit of those qualitative statements. And I've got a few here. I made a few notes I'll just refer to. One person said, I'm committed. Satisfaction is high. My manager is supportive and ensures we're taken care of. Another person says, I'm committed. I've worked here for 16 years. I'm proud of what we've achieved. And a third comment, I'm committed because my organization gives me the power to make a difference. The second part of that comment was also really interesting. Okay, go on. I'm loaded and stressed. However, people are well managed and have employees' backs. So those kind of comments help us to understand where that commitment's coming from.
Okay.
I'm committed.
And that's real value, isn't it?
Exactly. Exactly, it is. And that last comment, I'm loaded and stressed. So again, it just reflects, yes, I'm loaded and stressed. Yes, I have change fatigue, but I remain committed because I can still make a difference to what I do.
Okay. Anything else on those slides there that we were sort of wanting to have a look through or discuss?
I think that's a good summary of the overall results. Okay. In summary, change fatigue is real. People are experiencing change fatigue, but they remain satisfied.
Okay.
Engaged. They remain engaged.
So I know that we have some questions coming through. We've got some various things coming from the chat, and we'll come to those in a second. I promise we'll address those because I think they're quite relevant. But just in terms of this survey and these results that we've now seen, if we had to take that one step further, what are the sort of the ramifications? What's the impact of this?
Well, the good news, of course, is that whilst change fatigue is being experienced, certainly for now, people are remaining engaged. Okay. So yes, engaged, but exhausted. I guess the projection is, does that persist? Yeah. And I guess that's got to be part of the concern. And back to my analogy, if you keep asking people to run fast for a long time, can they keep doing it? Or sooner or later, if we keep asking people to run fast, is there a point at which you say, I've got to stop doing this?
This is where these are things like sort of weakness or stress, sickness, workplace absenteeism, all these things start to potentially come into play.
And that, I guess, would ultimately be the concern, because sooner or later, and this is what the literature told us, if fatigue is real, it can lead to a decrement in engagement. We didn't find that, but before long, if people do stop being engaged, they stop being satisfied. Change takes away their ability to make a difference. Their empowerment goes away. If change is poorly managed and done to them rather than with them, their involvement drops off. Okay. And all of those things start to have a negative impact. And you could perhaps pick those up with turnover intentions, whether people will remain with the organization, whether your organizational HR metrics start to change. Do you see an increase in sickness absence, workplace stress? Do you have an increase in organizational turnover, staff turnover?
Do you think all this has been exacerbated by everything that's happened in the last few years? People now working from home or remote working patterns have changed, particularly in this part of the world as expats, people working away from perhaps family and their own home countries. Do you think that all contributes towards this?
Almost certainly. And of course, we have seen a huge amount of change. Maybe some of the interesting observations is how much of that change has stuck and how much have people gone back to what they were familiar with. Yeah. So how many people have continued to work from home? Does that working from home actually have an impact on their well-being. It's not part of this discussion, but we did some more research at Podium to have a look at how individual personality can impact on that.
Okay.
Some personalities cope with that isolation better than others, but that's a discussion for another day. But a lot of people have reverted to what they did pre-COVID. I guess some of those changes have stuck, but the number of people that I talked to, and I had a conversation just this week with one of our clients, and they were saying that, actually all of that only happened a few months ago, but it feels like a bit of a distant memory. And if I look at the workplace today, actually it feels very much like it used to.
Right.
So people have reverted to what they were comfortable with and what they were familiar with. But there is a lot of change going on. The question is that if we continue that pace of change, will we continue to have fatigue? Will that eventually impact on engagement?
Okay. And again, we have some more questions around that, which we'll come back to in a second. But just before we get to that point, what would be your recommendations in order to be able to sort of proactively manage this change fatigue piece, if you like? What could we actually start to do? What could the people on the call start to do?
Well, one of the questions might be, is change fatigue a reality in my organization? And there's an old saying, if you can measure it, you can manage it.
Yeah.
So one of the possibilities, of course, could be to undertake a survey to see whether that exists in their organization. But if change is going to continue to happen in organizations, I think depending on your position of responsibility, it's all about, if we're going to do change, are we going to do change well? Yeah. And I think there's also a question in there about the necessity of change. And sometimes, can change be a gut reaction? We have a problem, let's change something, rather than we have a problem, let's increase the mastery of what we do already.
So perhaps some of that comes down to clarity of information, clarity of understanding of a particular business issue, strategy, those kinds of things.
Exactly. Root cause analysis. What was the problem here? What caused it? And do we need to change something? Yeah. Or does change become a habit because there seems to be this perception that we need to, to constantly adjust things to be successful?
It's quite interesting. We've talked about this before, and I know that some of the people on this call, we've had the conversation with as well about how we look at ways of work. So you've already touched upon the fact that clear communication is critical to manage change.
Yeah.
Actually working with your teams, understanding, thinking about mastering productivity, all of those kind of things start to come to the fore alongside employee well-being.
Yeah.
We know that we've worked successfully with a number of organizations implementing Viva goals and OKRs so that people have a clear understanding of what actually is my objective, what am I working towards, and how does that run through?
Yeah.
Would you support that sort of?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, some of the clear messages that came out of that literature review as to how people handle change most effectively, it is about making the uncertain more certain. What are we doing? Why are we doing it? What's the purpose? When will it start? What's the change plan? What will be the steps along the way? And how will we know when we've got there? So change is identified as a discrete entity and not some uncertain, unending, mysterious, continuous journey into the future with no idea where we're headed. Okay. So communication, planning, implementation, all of those things.
And clearly defined parameters. Exactly. What's happening when and where. We've had some great questions coming through, so thank you. I'd like to take the opportunity to put some of these to Carl. So please, whilst we're going through, if you have any other thoughts, add to those as you wish to. But the first one I would just like to share is a question from Vicky. What role does effective communication play in alleviating change fatigue? And what are some of the best practices for keeping employees informed? I think we've covered some of that already.
Maybe we did, yes. So I think the point we were just talking about, that change communication, I think, is really important. For change to come as a surprise to the workforce, to come as a surprise to the department and the team, people being asked to do things without an understanding of purpose, where it fits in, what the context is. So I think communication, planning, purpose, what we're doing, why we're doing it, when it will happen, what your role is, and maybe something about if we are asking you to do this, what are the priorities? If I'm asking you to do this and you already have a full workload, where can that fit in as a manager, as a management team? Where do we put the priorities? What resources can we put in place to help you deal with any additional responsibilities that come with that change requirement?
Okay, so proper planning piece is
exactly, yeah.
Okay, all right. Some more coming through from Nick here. Are there any specific warning signs or indicators that leaders can observe to identify when employees are experiencing change fatigue?
Hi, Nick. Yeah, great question. Again, I think we probably alluded to this. I think the first warning signs might well be the kind of things that managers are probably alert to anyway. The kind of things that you might have HR metrics for within a good organization. Are you starting to notice an increasing pattern of sickness absence? Are you starting to notice decrements in performance? Those HR metrics and those kind of things, I think would certainly be a very, very clear indication.
Okay, which I think leads into another question I've had here from Nick here, actually. What are the strategies or approaches that you'd recommend for leaders to proactively manage and mitigate change fatigue amongst their teams?
Okay, that's again a good question. And part of that for me, I'm shuffling my papers here because that spurred a thought, and it's reminded me of something that I read in one of the papers that we were talking about, and it came from one of those journals that was published in a journal called Workplace Stress, and it seems to imply that change is a certainty. Right. Now, to a certain extent, some people have said, that the only thing that is certain about the future is uncertainty and change. But there are lots of management philosophies out there that seem to imply that change is almost inevitable. If you take these management philosophies, something like Kaizen, for example, the definition of the Japanese term Kaizen is change for the better. Yeah. And it almost seems to, and with that kind of concept comes continuous improvement. That seems to imply that we are inevitably going to live within a world of constant change. And one of the comments, and I've just made a note of it here, from one of those papers. It was a paper in the journal Workplace Stress. The authors were Bernard, Walker, and Harris, just to show that this was an academic review. And this comment really stuck in my mind, and I think that it's really quite helpful to keep in mind. Many organizations caught up in trying to implement the latest and greatest management fads may neglect the strong and stable core ideology behind successful organizations. Thus, we urge organizations and change agents to remember that there has to be some structure and continuity in an organization to bind it together. So I think that there might be a bit of a plea within there, to ask about that. If we're contemplating change, is it absolutely necessary? Yeah. Would we not be better off, again, pursuing the mastery of what we do? What is it about this organization that is core to it? Can we stick to that? Does everything have to change? But if change is going to happen, how can you foster well-being and resilience? Make sure that change is well communicated. Make sure you're alert to the possibilities of change fatigue. Yeah. Listen to people. If you're getting messages along the lines of, I can't cope with this, what can you do to support people? Can you put extra resources in place? Can you redesign the work role? Yeah. Can you make sure that people have got clear responsibilities within the change plan? And keep that change discreet. As we said, the evidence is really quite strong. If change is well defined with a start point and a success goal end point, people can adapt.
Which comes back again to the importance of having that clear strategy and actually sticking to it, and not changing your strategy or direction as an organization every few months. Yeah. It's actually having that clarity of purpose and understanding what we're trying to achieve and what we need to do so.
Yeah.
Okay. Sharajan has sent a question in. Aren't we limiting the fatigue people experience at workplaces to just the changes they experience? Shouldn't the cause of fatigue be more inclusive with regards to the different experiences causing them? which I think we have touched upon slightly.
Yeah, I mean, fatigue can come from many things. It might not just be as a result of change. Part of the reason for having those qualitative questions in there about your the most directly relevant scale might be in that psychological exhaustion thing. And what more can you tell us about your psychological exhaustion? Just workload alone, your conventional workload, your unchanging workload.
Yeah.
Of course, it could also be a contributor to fatigue. So I think that as you analyze that quantitative feedback about, are you experiencing exhaustion? Yeah. What do you want to say about your exhaustion? And if the comments are coming back saying, I am exhausted because I'm having to change everything I do on a daily basis, it's change fatigue. If people are coming back saying, look, I'm exhausted because I've got too much to do and I can't do it in the time available, it's just about workload. So I think that's a really good point. If people are fatigued generally, it might just be about workload. But of course, the questions that we've asked
helps to define it.
To define that whether what people are reporting within this survey is a result of things related to change.
Okay, that may have answered the next question, which is from Zainab. How do I identify which employees are highly impacted by change fatigue? How to differentiate the ones who are stressed yet committed from those that are not engaged?
Wow. How will you know without asking the question? I guess there's a couple of possible answers that spring to mind. Just give me the first part of that question again, because it spurred a thought.
How do you identify which employees are highly impacted by change as an organization?
So the first thought that sprung to my mind when the first part of that question is that we know that in terms of people generally, if we look to understand workplace personality, there are some people that are excited and energized by change. Yeah. There's a very widely recognized model of workplace personality, or human personality generally, called the 5-factor model, the Big Five. One of the big 5 attributes of personality is openness to experience. People who are open to experience are keen to see new things, are keen to do things differently. They are energized by being taken outside of the comfort zone. But the converse of that is that there are also people in the population who much more quickly are uncomfortable if they're taken outside of what is familiar with them. So for those people, it could well be that they are the people who are going to be least comfortable with change, and particularly with the pace of change. I need time to adopt to a new comfort zone. So understanding your people. And if you work within an organizational space or an organization whereby you're in a rapidly changing environment, recruit for success. So, as you recruit people, you need to find and identify those people that are going to be open to that environment. So that could be part of it. But in terms of the second part of that question, how can you tell if people are feeling stressed? How can you tell if people are suffering from this kind of fatigue? Well, I guess you could kind of look for the signs and symptoms if they're not vocalized. Yeah. Sickness, absence, declining productivity, declining engagement, or you ask them. And how do you ask them? Well, exactly. You need to find out, and you can ask clear questions. Yeah. Again, the benefit of this being an anonymized survey. When you do this kind of survey, you're not asking people to identify themselves, but you can get because it wouldn't play well. No. In an organization, the management team looks at the results and says, "Oh, he said that." That's not going to feel particularly comfortable. But in an anonymized survey, people can say, "Look, whilst you can't identify me and my responses, I've now got a voice to say, actually, I'm struggling here."
Okay. There's a couple of questions here that have come in from Abhishek. First of which is that most of the research around the concept is done in the medical industry, and such quality of data from industry requires a detailed analysis to find the factors. Would you agree?
No, the literature that we reviewed was from the organizational psychology literature. So we weren't looking at medical, clinical, or otherwise. So there were journals, like the quote that I gave you was from a journal called Workplace Stress. So it was very much about work psychology. So no, I'm not sure that I would fully agree with the point that this is coming from the medical industry as a clinical issue, rather than this is a real workplace psychology issue.
I should actually add that Abhishek has also put the sentiment analysis of the text, i.e. the free text, I guess. that does help to be a good starting point to find those factors.
Exactly. But that was the point of doing the literature review. What factors contribute to change fatigue in the workplace? And it was those things that we talked about, the pace, the uncertainty, and so on.
So I know we have just under 10 minutes left. We have a couple of questions, again, I'd like just to be able to put to you. Another from Nick. Change within a single organization deals with familiar people and structure. Change in an M&A scenario involves many more unknowns. Have you got any advice for dealing with that situation?
M&A?
Mergers and acquisitions.
Oh, wow.
Thanks, Nick.
Yeah. That mergers and acquisitions environment, I think, by definition, is a huge change. There's lots of things that are going to happen. So often in mergers and acquisitions, there are questions about when these two structures come together. What is going to happen? They've got a finance team, we've got a finance team. You put the two together, do you need two finance teams? Is my job at risk? There's got to be uncertainty in there. It's probably unavoidable, but I think taking the lessons that we've talked about, communication, honesty, at the point of merger, I think then being honest with people that, when these two organizations come together, what will the new structure look like? How many positions will be in that new structure? And I think, the sooner that you can start to define and clarify and communicate, I might have to adapt. Things are going to change in my future. I thought I would work in this finance team for the next 10 years until I retire, but now they've merged with another organization. Will that opportunity be open to me? Maybe I need to start to plan. I can reduce my anxiety by planning and coming up with a personal action plan. Maybe if I know that there's only going to be one finance team, well, what are my chances of getting a place in that team? Or do I start to protect my own personal well-being by looking elsewhere? So I think the only thing you can do is to, as early as possible, be honest, open, communicate to help people adapt and plan their own futures.
And there is an onus on the individual as well, isn't there, to be able to have that mindset of being able to adapt?
Yeah, and there will, in that kind of environment, I think that you can only run so fast. So, the people who are managing that merger and that acquisition, they might not know quite what the final shape of everything will be. Yeah. So they've got uncertainty to deal with as well. And they can't answer your uncertainty until they resolve their uncertainty. So yeah, I think it's always a difficult environment to be part of. But the sooner you can have clarity, the sooner that you can communicate that as a management team, then people will be able to adapt. And some people, as you say, the onus will be on them to adapt in their own way.
Okay. I hope that answers that question. Thank you for that. Just a couple more. We've touched upon this already, actually. I think we have answered this to a certain degree, but how can we as HR effectively address change fatigue among employees and create a supportive environment during times of organizational transformation?
Yeah, we have answered that in part. I think that it is part about being open, having that listening ear, detecting the signs, detecting the symptoms, being, I think, alert to the idea that responsibilities might need to change, rather being proactive in role definition, updating job descriptions, updating that work design, making sure that we're not asking too much of one person or one department. We put the resources in place, but we listen, we understand if it's happening. I think if people know that they're being listened to as much as anything, and rather than being a lost voice in the wilderness, I'm suffering here, I'm suffering all on my own, I'm really struggling to run fast enough to keep up. If somebody's listening to that, then that of itself, I think, can have a really positive impact. And I think one of those qualitative comments that we reflected upon, that last one that I gave, I'm committed because my organization gives me the power to make a difference. I'm loaded and stressed, but my managers care and have got my back. So again, I think that it's just being alert to it and providing the support.
Okay. Final question before we start to wrap up. And I think actually this is to both of us. In a previous life, you were a senior L&D leader as well. So what are some of the innovative approaches or techniques that L&D departments can employ to build resilience and enhance change readiness amongst employees, enabling them to better adapt to organizational change?
I think this would probably be, for me, most focused on the change managers, to make sure that the change managers have got the tools and the skills to do it well, to understand what effective change management is, to make sure that they've got the practical tools. So that could be project management training, project management tools, so that I think that some of the clear messages we're getting from understanding how all of this happens is that when change has got to happen, change will be most effective. People will be least fatigued if change management is done well. So in the L&D department, I think it would be focusing on those change managers.
And I think we're seeing this as well. You mentioned earlier on, things like communications workshops, being able to effectively coach and work with your employees, with your workforce. We've seen a demand and an increased demand actually in terms of things like driving performance and productivity, but actually using those tools such as Viva Goals, OKRs in place to be able to effectively manage and see where people are and all of this kind of things.
Super.
I have another question here that just come through. I've got a flurry of things coming through thick and fast. As the Dubai community is predominantly an expat population, most have had to deal with a lot of change by moving here. Would you say that the results are mostly positive because this population is possibly more change agile? Amanda, great question.
I don't know whether we've got any evidence to speak to that, but I think that's a really good observation, actually, that almost by definition, a lot of the people who would be part of this survey, and I think that there was a good mixture in terms of nationals versus expats. But yeah, I think that if you are going to uproot your life from whatever country you came from before, move to a wholly new country, a wholly different culture, adapt, you're probably energized and engaged by that. And it might well be an explanation behind our survey results that, do you know what, we are change resilient. And we're resilient, meaning that we can deal with it. We might be fatigued, but you know what, we're still engaged because that's what excites us. Part of our energization is discovering new places, going new places, literally and metaphorically. And that might explain why, sometimes being asked to run fast for a long time and do lots of different things can be tiring, but you know what, we quite enjoy that. Yeah.
Very good. Excellent. I know we're coming up nearly to the top of the hour and to the end of the session, so I'll start wrapping up. Thank you for all of your questions, and thank you for posing those to Carl. A copy of the report will be made available to each and every one of you post this session. I will be sharing more details on our various social media channels, and look out as well for some further coverage around this particular topic through some broader channels over the coming weeks as we start to explore this a little bit further. Carl, thank you, not just for today,
Pleasure.
But also for the work that you've put in for the report, the reading, the compiling of all the responses and everything else. I'm sure that if people want to be able to reach out to Carl, that you'd make yourself available to. We'd be delighted to have conversations with you as well. But otherwise, thank you very much, and look forward to sharing the results of our survey and white paper with you, and then picking up the conversation from there in due course. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, guys. Nice to meet you all.